Hello everyone, back here in Elden Ring, and this time I want to talk to you about stance breaking. So stance breaking is where you're actually hitting an enemy for long enough or hard enough that you, surprise, surprise, break their stance. And the game will let you know that you've done this correctly with an audio cue, but also a visual cue. So for most enemies in the world, this will mean that they will fall down to their knees, and it'll open them up to a critical hit or a critical attack. And to carry out that critical hit, you need to be standing directly in front of them or directly behind them at touching distance and press R1. So the way I want you to think about stance breaking is that each enemy in the game has almost like an invisible stance meter. And each time you're continuously attacking them, this meter is building up over time. And when it reaches a maximum, that's when you break their stance. But what you have to consider is that if there's a long enough gap between them receiving hits, that meter will actually reset itself back to zero. Most players think that it's between 5 to 8 seconds, the gap. So for example, if you're hitting an enemy continuously, maybe you've rolled past an attack, carry on hitting, but then you're needing to maybe run away for a bit for whatever reason, and you come back to the combat and carry on hitting the enemy. But say if you've taken longer than 5 seconds to do so, when you come back, that enemy's meter, stance meter, will have actually reset itself back to zero. So you have to start from scratch in terms of building up the hits again before you're able to break their stance. So a useful thing to remember as well and to have in the back of your mind is that this mechanic is available to you during boss fights as well. So I would really urge you to experiment with whatever weapon is your preferred option to kind of carry out damage. As to how many hits and what type of hits you need to inflict on a boss before you're able to break their stance. Any windows of opportunity in Elden Ring, especially in boss fights, are like gold dust. So if you can have a chance to carry out a critical hit, or maybe just do other type of damage, or maybe heal or buff your character, or whatever it is you want to do, I think it's definitely worth considering. It's kind of a mechanic that really encourages a front-footed, aggressive approach, because it's telling you that if you keep on landing hits on an enemy, you will get rewarded with an opening. So obviously the things that will enable this almost invisible stance meter to increase over time are things that hand out a good amount of damage. So R2 attacks are handy for this. Charged R2 attacks, obviously double handing your weapon, R2 attacks again, jump attacks, guard counters are also very good. Also the skills or the ashes of war in your particular weapon are a great way again in which to build that damage and eventually break an enemy's stance. So for bigger enemies like dragons and golems, they will also stance break, and what will happen is that they'll collapse to the ground, but the visual indicator for them will actually be a glowing yellow circle. So if you go towards that specific area in their body, again, you have to be at touching distance and press R1. You can carry out a critical hit on those enemies too. So I'm going to be demonstrating that here now. So I'm just using a straight sword. I haven't upgraded it just because I want to be able to carry out a good amount of hits on the enemy without them dying straight away. And I'm going to demonstrate breaking the enemy's stance a couple of times. And each time that I break it, I'm going to carry out a critical hit. I'm going to be using the sword on one hand so as to not give out too much damage each time. But I'll be using R2 attacks exclusively. Probably one more probably causes stance break. There we go. So now we do an R1 critical, follow up with a charged R2, and we'll carry on building the meter up again. So when you carry out the critical attack, the meter resets. So then you have a chance to kind of build it up again for the next critical hit. There we go. Done it again. Another R1. Do another charged R2. We might not be able to do another one until the character now, or the enemy now dies, but we'll give it a go. Ah, there we go. We did it another time. And that time I just killed him instead of doing the critical. So it just goes to show that actually you can kind of get a rough idea over time as to, for specific enemies, how many hits of your weapon it takes to actually break their stance. So I would get you to kind of experiment and get really familiar with your weapon of choice, whether it's one-handed, two-handed, whether it's using your Ash of War, whether it's using guard counters, whether it's using jump attacks. If a certain enemy is giving you trouble, maybe try and approach it from an angle of like, okay, well, let's look at stance breaking. Let's look at landing hits, as many as I can without leaving too big a gap in between, and just see what happens. And then you almost end up with a rough formula that when you approach a certain type of enemy, you'll know, okay, well, this one I can maybe do 2 charged attacks and a normal attack, and I'll probably more than likely put him in a stance break position, and I can do a critical on him. So thanks for watching again, guys. I hope you found that useful, and I'll catch you all very soon.